This podcast is brought to you by the North Dakota Petroleum Foundation. From heating our homes and powering our vehicles to cell phones, clothing, and medical equipment, oil and natural gas makes everyday life better. North Dakota Oil and Natural Gas, advancing the possibilities. Learn more at ndpetroleumfoundation.org. Welcome to the Plain Talk Podcast, the first episode of 2022, which so happy to be with you, and had a little break from doing the podcast there for a while, but back at it now in the new year. And one of the things that we want to talk about, and I thought this was relevant because we're all coming back from a holiday break. Certainly the kids got time off over Christmas and New Year's. And I think anytime that happens, it's hard to get back to work, right? I took the week off between Christmas and New Year's. It's hard for me to get back in the swing of things. And I'm always thinking about that with the kids and the students and the teachers, trying to get back to the work as it was. And that got me thinking about some news we had from earlier this year related to test data showing learning decline in North Dakota schools during the pandemic. Now, this was actually released back in October from State Superintendent Kirsten Basler's office. And her statement on it read, I quote, "New test information shows a decline in student math and English proficiency during the 2020-2021 school year. The results offer evidence about how the COVID-19 pandemic affected student learning in North Dakota." And here's the actual numbers. And again, I'm quoting from the release. During the 2021 spring tests, the percentage of all students who scored as proficient or advanced in English language was 42%, a 5% decline in English language proficiency from the 47% recorded during pre-pandemic testing. In mathematics, the percentage of students who registered proficient or advanced scores in the spring of 2021 was 38%, which was a 7% decline. And this is what Basler quoted in the statement. She says, I quote, "This decline is significant, and it presents a challenge to all of us as educators in North Dakota. Fortunately, our schools have been provided unprecedented resources to use in reversing these trends. We have experienced significant loss, and we now are presented with an opportunity to make a significant comeback." So here to talk with me about that is Minot State University professor of education. This is a professor who teaches teachers, Dr. Dan Conn. Dan, how are you?
Very well. Happy New Year. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. Tell us, what did you make about these test results that came out?
It's funny you said that because I have a podcast, Ed Heads, and we actually invited Kirsten Basler on our podcast because I wanted to talk to her about this. And my impression is, I think those tests, so she's referring to the Smarter Balance test, which is produced by Pearson, and there's a lot to it, but it's not this just benign test. And I think, those numbers happen for a lot of reasons. I think they happen for a lot of economic reasons, probably people without access to, internet and tutors and things like that contribute. I think there's less time to teach directly to the test. I think a lot of times teachers in schools feel pressure for test prep, for essentially teaching to the test. And when you're expecting people to learn at home and under other conditions, it becomes more difficult to teach to the test. So I would definitely read that with a grain of salt. And I hope we don't go spiraling down this road where we're going to end up testing even more, which is absurd how much we test. But we'll test even more because we're worried about the test scores. And we'll take even more time away from learning, from art, from recess, from music, from all these things because we're worried about test scores, which are very expensive and I would argue are misleading.
So let me ask you, how worried? I mean, as a parent, I read this stuff and I'm worried, right? I mean, I want my kiddos, I want everybody's kiddos who are going to school, I want them to be making progress towards the skills that they're going to use later in life to be successful and prosperous and all the things that we want for them. So when really, I mean, should we be worried at all? I mean, how? You say take with a grain of salt. Give us some context.
Sure. Well, I think those tests are very narrowly noticing very few things, in terms of, you talked about work life. Lots of competent, intelligent people don't do well on those tests and go on to have great lives. Those tests are essentially what they're trying to find is who's going to make it past their first year of college. I mean, it's this big predictive thing with the ACTs and the SATs, and this kind of builds up to that. The reason why schools are testing, of course, is because universities were requiring those tests. Universities are now getting away from it. Over 700 universities are now either no test or test optional for the ACT, SAT, and because they know it's BS. They know it's classist. It's one of those things where test really, really punishes poor and working people. It really punishes rural people. And so when you hear those stats, I absolutely say take it with a grain of salt. I'm a pragmatist, and there's probably some value in that, that we could think about, but we should not hit the panic button. And in terms of your own kids, I think about their own well-being. Those test skills are just part of it, but so are the non-tested subjects: music, art, social studies, science, PE, recess, friendships, imagining. We're resilient. People are resilient. Just a little time off not being on the assembly line of K-12 education isn't going to kill them. And like I said, I think those test results are in a big part not being taught to the test as directly right before they take it.
So how do we? I mean, because the problem with this, I understand you're not a big one on testing, and I get that. In fact, Dan and I have actually been on a panel together before where we discussed this, and I think it's a hard thing that we go, because I'm not 100%. I get the complaints about, well, we're just teaching to the test and we're crafting our education not necessarily for the best interest of the kids, but maybe just teaching to the test, as you said. That's the succinct way to put it. But what metrics can we look at? Because obviously we just came through a period where we had something happen to our society, the pandemic, that impacted schools. The schools closed down even when they were reopened, because of quarantining guidelines and everything. A lot of kids missed significant amounts of time. The ability of kids to continue their education remotely from at home is going to hinge a great deal on the ability of parents to provide that at home. I mean, we send our kids to public schools or to schools in general because I'm not an educator, right? And all of a sudden, like, I'm trying to teach my middle schooler at home while also working. That didn't work out so well for us personally. I know a lot of families it didn't. But are there any metrics that we can look at to say, because at some point we have to make policy, and at some point we have to say, are we doing good? Are we doing bad? What can we be doing better? So if not these tests, what metrics should we be looking at?
I got 3 parts. I'll try to be succinct, though. So the first is in U.S. history, which I think historically we have a great education system. And it used to be back in the day, there would be these public exhibitions, and these are like the common school eras. And anyway, the public largely judged the school. And I think, locally, we can come up with ways at local levels to make assessments. I know that doesn't,
what do you mean, exhibitions? What are you, like spelling bees? Like, what are you talking about?
Yeah. They would actually get up and recite like geography and Latin and math,
because
equations.
I remember some of that. Like I think I took 3rd place in our regional geography bee at one point, or social studies. I forget which one it was.
Yeah, but so anyway, I think there's some value in like local control and being judged locally. I'm not sure if we're going to go back to public exhibitions, but I think with local governments, school boards, teachers know how to make tests. A lot of times the people making tests for Pearson, who is where Smarter Balance comes from, are working for like a little more than minimum wage, and they may not even have an education degree. I mean, it's fascinating. I think there are many local experts and professionals. So that's just like one little small part. It's important to know that NAEP, there's a national assessment, which I actually think is pretty good, and it happens in 5th grade and 8th grade. And that's a pretty good indicator. And that way you're not just looking at it all the time. I kind of think of it like if you want to lose weight, you don't want to get on the scale every day. You want to look at it, do things, and then periodically go back to the scale. Otherwise, you can become obsessed with the weight itself. And that's not going to lead to good health. And then the last thing I'll say is, and this is what I want to talk to Kirsten Baszler about, I think we could come up with a better system ourselves. I think North Dakota could actually lead the way on that. I know she's the chair of the National Executive Group, which is basically all the state superintendents throughout the states and the territories. But anyway, I think North Dakota could do it. The big thing about the test is there are psychometricians that sign off on that. we've been working with NDSU and other people, and they have good psychometricians. My friend Nathan Anderson, him and I and co-author of a book that I wrote, Michelle Tenham-Zamak, are trying to come up with an alternative to standardized test as we know it that looks more holistically at students. And I think North Dakota could really lead the way on that. I think there's a lot of opportunity to do it right. The ACT and the SAT have their roots in like eugenics, so I kind of think of it like polishing a turd as they make the ACT, SAT better. Like you can polish it, but it's still like foundationally problematic, where I think we could come up with something better, more creative, not so elitist. I know you're into politics. When we think of the political divide in our country right now, I would argue that it's mostly based on whether you went to college or not. And I don't mean that as a slight to people that didn't go to college, but I think those that pass the test go into a world where they're presented different kinds of knowledge than those that don't. And it's leading to all kinds of divides. So anyway, I think we have to do something better. I agree there has to be a metric. There are a couple from the past we could learn from, but in addition, I think we could come up with something better fundamentally.
I think there could be a lot of appeal for that in North Dakota. North Dakotans like local stuff. We like to do things ourselves. And look at how often we sue the federal government, right? We would rather make rules for ourselves here in North Dakota. Maybe this is an area where we should think about it. The problem is, and I don't understand a lot of the testing and stuff, it seems like it's tied to federal dollars. Like that seems to be the big fear when we talk about trying to change some of the stuff locally is, well, the feds tie the money that they're going to give us or potentially give us or our eligibility for grants and all of that big pot of money that has strings tied to it. And a lot of those strings are tied to testing, so it can't just, in some ways, unless we want to just say goodbye to a lot of that federal funding, which is a not insignificant amount of money, it becomes hard to make decisions. And I say that as, again, I'm a states' rights federalist, right? So I don't like that the federal government has their tentacles in all of that stuff. I would rather the decisions be made locally, but as a practical matter, given the ties to that federal money, that's tough sometimes.
No, that's a great point. So I think on one level, those tests, so there are like 4 companies that control everything. Pearson, which the Obama administration really liked Pearson, so you'll notice it's tied to a lot of Obama initiatives. McGraw-Hill, which is who the Bush administration really liked, and you can notice them. IES, which is what, like, I know your wife is a teacher and she had to take a test for that, the Praxis. So that's IES. And then there's Houghton Mifflin, which is another major publisher. And what those guys have is they have reliable data. And that's what I'm saying. If we have psychometricians, which we do, we could come up with reliable data that would satisfy what the federal government wants. Now, I think there's a lot of like political dealings and lobbyists and reasons why those 4 companies get it. But if we wanted to buck the system as North Dakota, I would argue we could come up with valid and reliable data ourselves that would satisfy that criteria. And one more thing, I'm from Colorado. A local district actually didn't accept those dollars. So it's basically Title I dollars that goes to like special ed and things like that. They didn't accept those dollars and just use Pell Grants and other things. I don't know if that's a
that's going to
option,
depend.
but,
You look at some of our rural counties, and they're trying to support their schools with a property tax base that is often tiny. You're a local governing entity, a local school board, or even the state of North Dakota's ability to do that is going to be very dependent. Maybe we could. If we were willing to devote the sort of resources we do, but North Dakotans don't like property taxes either, so that's part of the problem.
I agree. No, it's just worth mentioning, but I think the first option, what I was talking about, would be more desirable. And with Baszler being on that national council, she has a lot of say and a lot of power. She said she's going to meet with me after the first of the year, so I'm hoping to continue these conversations, because why not innovate? And those companies, Pearson, they make like hundreds of billions of dollars a year. That's crazy. And they're in England. So we're like exporting this money to an English company that we could be making right here in North Dakota. And imagine, I don't think we need to charge hundreds of billions of dollars a year, but it would be something that could employ people, that could add to the economy. We could tax it as a state. It could be a positive thing instead of relying on the British to decide what counts and what doesn't count for learning.
I think you said something interesting too about, sort of the path, some of these testing stuff. I took a very non-traditional. I was present on the NDSU campus for a while. I wouldn't say that I was spending a lot of time going to class because I didn't exactly have the right priorities when I was 19 years old. I like to think I've done better than, but I didn't get a degree. And I feel like I've done okay for myself. And I think we've sort of embraced this idea that there's one path to prosperity, and that path goes from high school to college to career to retirement. And I think there's more paths than that. And we're seeing some of that where, we're seeing a focus on, let's focus on teaching somebody a trade. Like, you're interested in welding, you get the training and the classes and stuff you need to do that, or to be a mechanic. I mean, some of those trades, maybe people don't look at them as being very sexy, but I think that's sort of a beginning of what you're talking about.
Oh, totally. And the tests do that to us. The reason why those skills aren't valued in high school is because they don't translate to test. And I taught in rural Colorado, and there were so many smart kids that just didn't do that well on the test, and then they didn't have opportunities. Robin, I got to say, too, I think you're, one of the more intelligent people I've ever met. And I'm glad you didn't go to college, because I think in some ways I'm glad you didn't graduate, because in some ways I think that gives you a perspective and a voice. We were talking about this, but a lot of media folks are produced from like 30 institutions that I think kind of indoctrinate them to some sort of neoliberal ideology, and you see it all over, the major
indoctrination's even indoctrination's a strong word, I would say, because I know a lot of these people. I work with them. I don't think that they're like twirling their mustaches and going to secret meetings but I would not to say that you suggested that, but I think it's more just, if you have a certain background and you have a certain life experience, you're going to have a tendency to see the world a certain way, and it's hard to escape that no matter who you are.
Oh, totally. Yeah. And I'm progressive, but to be rough on my own, I think some of those institutions are liberal. And if you're not liberal, you better not say too much. And there's some backlash, and we have lots of published incidents of that. And again, I'm kind of progressive, so I probably agree with those professors, but because it's so top down, it becomes, you're right, indoctrination is a hard word, but those that do really well on the test end up going to these elite institutions, and they end up kind of thinking generally the same on things.
They go to a place, they have similar life experiences, and lo and behold, they end up seeing the world the same way. And the thing is not everybody has those life experiences. Let's get back to the pandemic a little bit. You said something interesting, that the NAEP test is maybe a better one, because it's more of a, I don't know what's the right word for it, more of a, you're testing more of cumulative, right, as opposed to incremental. I don't know if that makes any sense, but that made sense to me. So are we, if we really wanted to measure what the pandemic did to, is it going to show up in the NAEP testing eventually? Because we're probably not far enough along where that's going to show up yet.
That's correct. Yeah. So actually the last NAEP results came out right before the pandemic. And what we saw was there was actually a pretty significant drop in reading. And that's interesting, because we've been testing reading more and monitoring reading more. So why did the scores go down on NAEP? But yeah, absolutely. So we're like, I think 3 years out from NAEP results, but that will be an interesting thing that we can study and wonder about. I like NAEP, though. It's, to me, a little bit more benign than the other ones. The other ones are these for-profit companies, although ETS isn't, but they make a lot of money. And they're just trying to, really generate dough more than they are serve the public, which I think NAEP is actually trying to serve the public.
Do you think a lot of this stuff could be, if it was developed internally? I mean, because that's really what you're calling for, is like the North Dakota Department of Instruction, Public Instruction, just hire the people it takes to develop the testing regimen that's going to produce the metrics that we can then turn when we're going to make policy about schools or whatever, whether it's at the local level or at the state level. Is that what you're talking about? Is instead of going to these companies, just doing it internally?
Well, that's a good question. We actually, my friend Nathan Anderson and Michelle, who I mentioned earlier, we started a company, and that's one of the things that we're looking at doing, which, to be honest, it's a for-profit company, and I'm not against profit. I think profit's a good thing, but we've put a lot of time and effort into this, and we had to hire a psychometrician. We did some work for North Dakota State. We're in talks with Minnesota, with their university system, of coming up with a better system than the ACT, SAT for freshmen. So we're thinking of these things, and I think, it could come with the public. Like you said, I think the public should definitely be involved, but I also see an opportunity for the business sector. And in our case, we see it as a financial opportunity. The book that my friends and I wrote about, we talk about getting rid of standardized tests right now in the current form, kind of like pulling weeds. And if you don't replace it with something else, it's just going to be taken over by more weeds, and so I think this is our opportunity to do it right, to do it well. And in my mind, it should be a relationship with both private and public entities.
How much of this too is, because we talk about, well, we're going to do testing and we're going to measure, and then we talk about it in terms of school performance, right? How are teachers doing? How are educators doing? How is school policy performing? We don't talk a lot about parents, and I understand why in the political world you don't. You look at the gubernatorial election in Virginia, where you had the Democratic candidate came out and said, "I don't understand why parents have to be so involved in education," and he ended up getting creamed. It is for political people, it is a third rail to start criticizing parents. But I'm thinking to myself, it's hard to overestimate how impactful a parent is on a student's ability to do well in school, or do well even on a test, right? If your kid was up all night the night before because you didn't implement a reasonable bedtime, or you didn't feed the kid a good meal, or you didn't you were fighting with your spouse or your boyfriend or something all night and the kid couldn't sleep, those things are going to impact the child's ability to be successful, right? And we don't often talk about that. The pandemic, we talked a lot about, what we've seen domestic violence go up, but I don't hear a lot of that getting talked about within the context of education. Like, how much do those other things that are happening in the home, and I guess you touched on some of them, maybe economic reasons, maybe dad lost his job or mom couldn't find a job or whatever it was. I don't know how we would even begin to quantify it, but that often I feel like it gets overlooked when we start talking about school performance.
Oh, totally. And then, throw in there were maybe students out on the farm during the pandemic, and they had to help more out on the farm. And so they learned things that don't necessarily translate into those tested items. There's just a variety of things. I know, too, a lot of parents that could afford it hired private tutors during the pandemic. And so if you kind of think about that, then their students have
it's hard. Good for them. That's great,
yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
That's fantastic. But also, I don't want to shame people who are doing that, because that's great if you can do it. But a lot of people can't. And, that's a leg up, and it's hard to quantify some of that stuff when you're saying, every student doesn't present themselves at schools, equally prepared and equally ready to do the things in school. That's a tough thing. And I don't know how, and the pandemic obviously turned a lot of that stuff on its head. I'm certain that my daughter maybe could have done well in school if I was a better teacher at home, right? If I was better able to have monitored, but it was tough. I'm over here trying to do interviews and trying to do my job, and she's sitting 10 feet away from me, and I think she's working on her computer, or maybe she's playing Among Us. I don't know what she's doing, right? I'm doing my best over here, but I'm not a teacher, and I didn't, I'm not doing that full time. And a lot of families ran into that, and I don't know how we quantify that in terms of policy and measurements and metrics and everything else.
Yeah, I'm with you. And maybe we don't. I think one of I love enlightenment, and there are good things about enlightenment, but I think trying to standardize people has been problematic for a variety of reasons.
Is that part of the enlightenment, standardizing people?
Yeah, that's going back to eugenics. That's
okay.
Kind of what took us to that is this idea that you could standardize people, and that's where standardized assessments originate.
Right. Well, no, I agree with that. That is a big part of it, and which to me is a big part of the reason why I'm a concern. Not to turn this political, but a big part of my ideology is predicated on the idea that people are individuals, right? And I think that's a fundamental friction between sort of politics and reality, is that we make policies for the aggregate, for the masses, right? It's the law, and everybody's equal under the law. But the problem is individuals are not equal. We have equal rights and everything, but as individuals, right, we have different strengths and different weaknesses, and those vary from person to person as individuals. And so we make public policy for the aggregate, and we experience it as individuals, and that is a constant friction that we're having. And which I think gets to your point, how do we make it the best way to tailor it to each individual? And the best way to do that is probably localize it.
I think so too. Yeah. And really trying to think, in my mind, it becomes so based on intellectual qualities and these very narrow intellectual qualities when other things matter too. in an intellectual sense, art, music, things like that are so important in just our well-being in our society. Thinking of FFA and students that are good at turning wrenches and welding. I mean, those are so important in our society. Thinking of people pursuing passions and things that they're willing to dedicate time and energy into. I mean, there's value in that. And I think when it's so narrow that it's mostly reading and writing and everything that can be assessed, we lose track of the great diversity we have in our nation to do a variety of tasks and jobs. And anyway, I think it undermines our democracy ultimately.
We spent a lot of time looking down our noses at like janitors and plumbers and people like that, right? Which is too bad. I went through a phase where I liked to read a lot of like zombie novels, right? That was kind of all the rage a while ago. And I always got to thinking, like, what role would I be, like in the dystopian future, right, where we don't have, and I don't know what, like, my skill set is very much a skill set that's for this society. Like, if I had to live in the future where I had to fix things, I would be completely lost, Dan, because I don't know how to do it. I mean, it takes all types. Those jobs are important, and so I don't know. I again, this when this release came out in October, it made a lot of headlines, and I think it got a lot of people worried and everything else. And I think what you're saying is, A, maybe don't be as worried as you think you should be, and B, let's maybe think about some different ways of measuring this and producing these tests. That's what you're saying?
Yeah, absolutely. And if I could just add one thing to that, the book that I co-authored is called Unraveling the Assessment Industrial Complex. And if you kind of think of the military industrial complex, they drum up reasons for war so that then they can make more money. And I think the test makers in particular make a lot more money when we talk like this. And just know that the more we worry about taking tests, the more we're going to take tests, and the more that we're going to make this assessment industrial complex more complicated and have a strong grip.
If you're in the business of testing, then of course testing is going to be the most important thing you see. And
exactly.
And I'm not, again, testing is not unimportant. It's just maybe not as important as the people who make tests for a living think. I think that's exactly. I don't think that's an unfair conclusion at all. Well, Dan, I appreciate it. And just any last tips again for everybody who's thinking, gosh, my students maybe they've lost some on their trajectory through their education careers. Any tips out there for parents?
Yeah, in a practical sense, I think a lot of elementary parents feel the pressure if their students aren't reading as fluently. There's a lot of big deal to hear about that. And things like just putting closed captioning on your TV can sometimes help with that. Being willing to read to your students and things like that. But then also know, as adults, we don't get measured on how fluently we read. These kind of things that we're flipping out on right now don't really matter in the long run, and kids are resilient. Kids will bounce back. I really have strong faith in our humanity and think that in the long run, think big picture, think about their health, make sure they're getting enough sleep. You don't want them staying up all night worried about an assignment and then lose out on sleep or other parts of their health that also matter.
Well, Dan, I thank you so much for your time, and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you. Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.